originality. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot nowadays, but creation is rarely, if ever, a lightning strike from nowhere. It's almost always evolution. An idea adapting to pressures, branching off, and slowly, over generations, becoming something new. So today I want to take a look at a microcosm of a microcosm, and how design approaches arise from a common ancestor. And for my feeble, fleshy brain, nowhere is that process clearer than the phylum of social deduction and its evolutionary history. I want to explore these selective pressures that created games to find clever adaptations, and how new, unique niches pop up. And for the fun of it, I'm also going to rate each game in a tier list, based entirely on how excited I am to play it. S tier would be a game that's an excellent use of my own free will, while F tier is me, a puppet in a deterministic nightmare, begging for the sweet, sweet release of a different game night. So let's go back to the very start and see where this all began. Every social deduction game owes its existence to a single common ancestor, invented in the 1980s called Mafia, which was later reskinned into the more popular theme of werewolf. For the sake of my sanity and physical well-being, I'm going to refer to these two as identical games, but just themed differently. Anyways, the formula werewolf has is magical because it taps directly into our primate brain's fear of the other. And it creates this sense of paranoia through a simple social imbalance. First, there's an informed minority, those werewolves, who know exactly who their allies are. Then there's the sprawling, uninformed majority, those villagers who are clueless on who's who. At night, the werewolves secretly collect themselves and kill someone. And then by day, all the survivors argue, accuse, and vote to kill someone they think is a werewolf. It's pure paranoia and distrust distilled into a game. And this formula results in a brilliant genre-creating concept that has infected the minds of millions of people. But this progenitor game had two major selective pressures working against it. First, player elimination. If you're the first one killed, your game night is basically over. Your genes are out of the pool. And some people may just think this is bland and boring game design, but for a lot of groups, it's simply a design death sentence, especially for a game that wants to be played at a party. Nobody wants to be the first one out watching everyone else have fun for 60 minutes. Second, werewolf needs a moderator, a non-player who has to run the whole show. It requires essentially someone to fill the role that's better suited by a computer. And since the moderator doesn't make decisions, there's practically no game for them. It's just a huge logistical hurdle and removes one player from the fun entirely. So how excited am I to play a traditional game of werewolf? Not at all. For years this was the entire phylum, but time has moved past it, and the evolutions that branched from werewolf are just more adapted to today's gaming sensibilities. Honestly, there is no situation that I can see myself willingly wanting to play classic werewolf for my own enjoyment. So it goes straight to F tier. Now, after years and years of Mafia and werewolf, there was a great speciation event. A new generation of designers decided to tackle those two big problems head on. And from that split, the entire modern phylogenetic tree was born. So let's see where it goes. A great adaptive leap was a game called The Resistance and its fantasy twin Avalon. These games are the progenitor species for an entire branch of the tree, and they changed everything by introducing 3 radical mutations. 1. No player elimination. 2. No moderator. 3. Mission-based gameplay. Instead of voting to kill someone each round, the group votes to send a team of players on a mission. In secret, the players on that mission choose to either help it succeed or make it fail. But the good guys have to let it succeed, and the bad guys can choose to let it fail. For example, in a 5-player game, you can send 3 people on a mission. It fails. You now know with 100% certainty that at least one of those 3 people is an agent of darkness. You don't know who, but you have a concrete, logical piece of data, which your friends will now proceed to completely and utterly ignore. The entire game becomes by creating these little cutouts of information until they all overlap like a stencil, and then you can definitively identify those traitors. This is a very clever adaptation The game removes the whole survival-based gameplay and instead focuses on information you gain from watching who goes on what mission and whether that mission passes or fails. The Resistance and Avalon retain all that paranoia of Werewolf, but everyone gets to play the whole game without the need of a moderator or any player elimination. Now, Avalon Big Box is one of my most frequently used games as an introduction into social deduction. The Percival Merlin Morgana sandwich is a perfect logic puzzle for people getting into board games. Plus, there are a ton of very fun variants, like using the Lady of the Lake, or the Two Lancelots, or the Sorcerers, which all add a unique spin on the core puzzle, while still feeling like a practice in logic-based social deduction. So I'm actually going to place it into A tier. It's a really good time, and arguably the best entry point into the genre as a whole. The Avalon and Resistance speciation event was so successful, it spawned its own diverse descendants that each filled a new niche in the ecosystem. Secret Hitler took that core DNA and added in a policy deck, which essentially created a rubber band mechanic that creates a more consistent drama. In a deterministic nutshell, when the fascists are winning, more liberal policies appear in the deck to balance things out, and vice versa. It's a probability-based source of drama that dramatically changes the feel of the game. It also repurposed the vestigial organ of player elimination from Werewolf, but it made it a more rare, high-stakes political act near the end of the game rather than a routine first-round event. And while the game is undeniably popular, its core engine, that policy deck, has a critical flaw. This rubber banding mechanism feels less like you're playing the game and more like the game is playing you, manufacturing artificial drama at the expense of player agency. There is an undeniable sense that the game has an arc that it fulfills through the agenda deck, and not necessarily through player choices. And look, I enjoyed Secret Hitler back in the day, but after a few dozen games, the strings of the policy deck become painfully obvious. It sells an illusion of drama that is dictated by that policy deck that I just can't get over, and truthfully, I just feel like a passenger while playing this game. It goes into F tier. But what if you could fix those flaws? What if you kept the policy deck but gave new avenues of agency and adventure? Well, a modern redux called Feed the Kraken attempts to do exactly that. Its first major mutation is the addition of a true third faction, the Cultist. A faction with its own goals and aspirations of being eaten by the titular Kraken, which is relatable. This Cultist is a pseudo-neutral faction that tries to play both sides and even out the game when either the sailors or the pirates are dominating. Plus, they grant some really cool additional powers like handing out more guns or converting another player into a cultist, which can be a really interesting and, most importantly, fun little mind game. Another massive addition is an actual physical ship moving around and activating events. It adds back that board into the board game. It's just innately more engaging seeing this ship move around rather than just placing pass or fail markers on a tally. Plus, there's the addition of unique character cards, which are mostly one-time use powers, but are powerful enough to give players a chance to sway the tides in their favor. It's a small but appreciated way to create some player asymmetry beyond just the loyalty that's dealt to them. Now, very importantly, the policy deck from Secret Hitler is reimagined as navigation cards that have a subtle but improved method of selection. In essence, it creates a triangle of trust. The captain and their chosen lieutenant secretly select 2 navigation cards and then pass those 2 options to the navigator. The navigator then has the final say on which of those 2 cards gets played, often without knowing who to trust. It's a subtle change that adds one more player into the mix, but this 3-way pull of influence feels more engaging than just removing a card from a deck. Now, don't get me wrong, it still feels like there's a rubber band being stretched, and ultimately I find this system flawed overall. But there is another key improvement. The way that voting occurs is completely different. Instead of yays and nays that happen in Avalon and Secret Hitler, it's more of a risky gambit in Feed the Kraken. Essentially, you get a certain amount of guns, and if the total number of guns revealed exceeds a threshold, you create a mutiny, and the player who revealed the most guns is the new captain. It actually feels very impactful revealing 3 guns near the end of the game and becoming the next captain, which adds to a sense of player agency way more than just vote in no in Secret Hitler. These refinements address many of the limitations of earlier species in this branch, and a lot of little changes make for a lot of big improvements over that ancestor of Secret Hitler. I find Feed the Kraken a more well-rounded, full experience that adds a ton of good ideas into a somewhat flawed system. I'm going to place it in B tier. Now, please bear with me because evolution can get subtle. Avalon has a recent direct descendant called Quest. It looks like Avalon, smells like Avalon, but it is a completely different species of game. This is the perfect example of how a few key changes can evolve a genre. Now, going back to Avalon, missions are the game. But in Quest, missions are just the data gathering for the real game, which happens at the final act. In Quest, the evil team consistently will get to 3 failed missions. This triggers a masterful 2-step endgame. First, the blind hunter can reveal and try to identify specific good roles through their hunt. But if they're wrong about who they identify, good wins instantly. If they can find the good players and identify them, evil wins. Second, if the blind hunter decides not to hunt, it triggers something called Good's Last Chance, where everyone points at 2 different players and then the evil players will drop their hands, no longer pointing at anyone. If the good players are all only pointing at evil players, then good wins. Now, why do I mention this finale? Well, it's because there are multiple levels of bluffing and misdirection at play in this stage. The evil players want to pretend to be good to mess up with Good's Last Chance, just as much as the good players want to hide and pretend to be evil to avoid the blind hunter's hunt. It's not really a one-way system like in Avalon and traditional social deduction games, where everyone is more likely to blend in and try to be good. Instead, it's much more of an even playing field, where everyone is trying to bluff or even double bluff and try to deduce as much information as possible at any given time. Quest is clever in that it gives lots of new tools for this, but that double bluff and that bluffing system adds a lot of depth to a complex puzzle. It's actually such a clever remix of that original puzzle from Avalon that core principles have been redeveloped. For example, the actual good-evil player breakdown, it's completely different. In Avalon, a 9-player game has 6 good, 3 evil. But in a 9-player game of Quest, there will be only 4 good players and 5 evil players. Which is insane when you think about it because there are actually more evil players than good in a social deduction game. Now, the sad thing is that the game is hamstrung by something just really unfortunate, and that's rule discrepancies. The game has multiple rule sets that just muddy the waters a little bit. I recommend using the director's cut version, but a lot of people who just buy games without digging much deeper might be disappointed by the default rules. Second, I think while the endgame puzzle is flat out excellent, it is difficult to explain the flowchart of what happens in each scenario. And Avalon is still a better entry point into the genre. I know that was a lot of details, but I wanted to show evolution in action, how subtle changes can change the entire species of the game. Quest takes all the DNA of Avalon and then remixes it into a fundamentally unique puzzle that feels challenging in clever ways. It's more of an even battlefield of logic puzzles rather than just hiding from predators. And for that, I can really appreciate its design approach, even with its sometimes awkward clunkiness. It goes to the top of B tier, but I can totally understand if you think it's better than Avalon. But evolution doesn't follow a single path. While one branch was evolving towards missions and logic puzzles, another took the opposite approach. It didn't refine into a narrow, sensible point. It built the genre into these giga games. It's like these designers looked at Werewolf and thought, you know what this needs? Resource management, dice rolling, 10 different card types. Also, let's make it take 4 to 5 hours. And let's get started with the classic ancestor for this heavyweight lineage, Battlestar Galactica the board game. This game is a true hybridization event. It took the primal DNA of the hidden teams from Werewolf and fused it with the complex resource management DNA of a cooperative strategy game. You're not just looking for liars, you're managing resources, fighting off enemy ships, and dealing with crisis after crisis, all while knowing that one or more people may be trying to actively sabotage the entire ship. It's all the suspicion and paranoia, but bolted onto a massive, complex space opera. I think what BSG really thrived with was the creation of a traitor's dilemma. And what I mean by this is that as a Cylon, you just can't fail every single task. You'll be discovered and put into the brig for the entire game. You have to engage in subtle sabotage. You have to play cards that are almost good enough, making suboptimal but defensible choices, all while still pretending to be a loyal human. It's an incredibly fascinating strategic challenge when it works, and conceptually it's an evolutionary leap that transforms a simple traitor mechanic into a narrative-generating behemoth of asymmetrical roles and mental warfare. But BSG's ambition is also its critical flaw. The sheer size and all the bolted-on mechanics can cause the game to creak and groan like an aged ship under its own weight. At its worst, it feels surprisingly duct-taped together. Especially with those multitude of expansions, which all add cool things, admittedly, but eventually it feels like you're trying to watch a movie and you have 5 different remotes that all don't let you change the volume. For all of its brilliant ambition, I still have to be in the right mood to wrestle with it. And for that, it's a solid B tier. Dead of Winter did for zombies what BSG did for space, adding a nice veneer over the core hidden traitor mechanics, while tossing in some personal secret objectives. To me, Dead of Winter always felt a bit messier, a bit less engaging than its ancestor of BSG, which is hard to believe because BSG can already feel super messy. I think there are a couple of really big flaws to Dead of Winter. For example, it's possible for there to be no betrayer at all, meaning that any deduction or social elements just end up falling flat. And I get it, not every game needs to have a betrayer. The threat of a betrayer in the midst is often good enough for the game to function. But when there's no actual traitor, the core cooperative game isn't strong enough to carry the experience on its own. In all honesty, people might not even consider this a social deduction game, but I still think it belongs in the evolutionary tree. Second, the personal objectives are just kind of boring. They don't ever feel like meaningful choices that create interesting tension. They're more like random chores that you have to do and you eventually just get pulled away from any group dynamic. It's the board game equivalent of doing a fetch quest in a video game, and it just pulls away from any meaningful strategic dilemmas. Third, the game is just kind of repetitive. I find myself going through the same motions round after round, unlike in BSG where decisions feel hefty and meaningful and they are part of a narrative beat. Dead of Winter and its challenges and scenarios feel more like administrative busywork, almost like it's a game of inventory management. Ultimately, Dead of Winter is more of a vehicle for a fun story than it is really an engaging social deduction experience. Like those infamous crossword cards are very thematic and sometimes make for a very fun read, but they don't ever cross into excellent gameplay. For me, this sloppiness overshadows that storytelling, and Dead of Winter really amplifies those messy, boring parts of BSG, while moving away from the fun traitor and paranoia in the game. Ultimately, if the thought of playing a game feels more like a chore than a choice, that's an easy D tier game. And that brings us to the current genetic titan in this lineage, Unfathomable. This is, for all intents and purposes, Battlestar Galactica 2.0. It takes the very same BSG chassis, streamlines a lot of the clunky rules, and gives it a Cthulhu skin. Now, why swap away from Cylons to Cult Cthulhu? Well, it turns out a beloved sci-fi TV show comes with a massive licensing fee and IP battles, but ancient, unknowable cosmic horror is gloriously public domain. And here's where the evolutionary tree gets a little bit weird. In a perfect example of convergent evolution, both of the major branches we've discussed, the streamlined mission-based games and these complex heavyweights, ended up in the same place. Both Feed the Kraken and Unfathomable are Cthulhu-themed traitor games on a boat. They arrived at the same destination from a different evolutionary path. It's the board game equivalent of carcinization. Everything eventually evolves into a crab. or a Cthulhu game on a boat. So if you can swallow the generic theme, mechanically Unfathomable is an excellent refinement. It's a leaner, cleaner, more polished version of its ancestor. Seriously, it's practically the same game without the rule funk, the unintuitive aspects, and a stronger focus on all of the good stuff. I especially enjoy it with the expansion From the Abyss, which adds a ton of very clever and very fun mechanics with the use of those allies and the horrors, which just makes the game feel good to play from start to finish. It is the current apex predator of the heavyweight branch, and it earns a spot in S tier. I actually made a whole review for it a while back, so if you want more information, definitely check that out. So we've seen one branch of the tree solve werewolves' problems by streamlining and another by building massive, complex games. It's opposite directions in game design, but both fill a unique niche with further evolutionary adaptations that follow. So that brings us to the question, what happened to the lineage that didn't want to change the formula, but perfect it? This is the True Descendants lineage. In this branch, the designers took one look at the original werewolf and decided to double down on those selective pressures as core gameplay mechanics. They took the core principles and perfected them into a bigger, stronger game. At first, the attempt to perfect werewolf just meant adding more of everything. Many games tried to do this, but the most common descendant is Ultimate Werewolf, which took the classic game and triggered an explosion of new roles. Investigative roles, protective roles, chaotic roles, all creating a vastly more complex web of possibilities. But to me, this is an evolutionary dead end. It's still just a bigger web built on a shaky foundation of the original werewolf. More roles don't fix those core problems. Player elimination still sucks, and you still need a moderator to keep things going. Ultimate Werewolf ultimately falls for the same pitfalls, which results in the worst sin of all, boredom. Honestly, I don't ruminate much on this side of the evolutionary branch, because while games can feel a bit more wild, they don't ever feel more interesting. So yeah, Ultimate Werewolf, it goes straight to F tier. Okay, so if that approach is a flop, how do you perfect the original? Well, you can't just add more stuff, you need to fundamentally re-engineer the flaws. And that brings us to the apex predator of this entire branch, Blood on the Clocktower. Clocktower keeps the core loop, day, night, accusations, execution, but it solves the two big selective pressures in brilliant ways. 1. It acknowledges player elimination by giving dead players a ghost who can still participate and even get one final vote. Some roles even want to be killed off early to activate their unique abilities, which keeps players far more engaged after a death. 2. It mutates the moderator role into a storyteller, a supreme game master-like role that is so much more engaging and interesting. It's a role with its own agency and ability to create unique twists, thus keeping all the players engaged if done well. But its true genius is how it treats player roles. The use of scripts, these curated sets of roles that create specific gameplay puzzles, enables a crafted experience that makes each scenario feel unique. These scripts create just enough doubt about what roles are in play, while providing logical frameworks for deduction. Even in the simplest scripts, like Trouble Brewing, has really neat roles like the drunk, who think they're an entirely different role, or even the poisoner, who can secretly break other players' abilities, which all creates these layers of misdirection and confusion that keep even experienced players guessing and trying to deduce what's going on. And look, I'm probably a bit biased, but I think Blood on the Clocktower is a gigantic step forward in this genre. The scripts are clever and almost endlessly replayable, with a ton of hidden depth and ways that you can approach each role. It's almost like that puzzle I talked about in Quest, with that blind hunter and Good's Last Chance. But every single script in Blood on the Clocktower is at that level, and then even amplified into a more complex string of bluffs, double bluffs, and general social deduction delicacies. I've seen nights where people are so convinced that they have the puzzle solved, but they just have one missing piece, which completely recontextualizes the whole game. It's just so much fun seeing the shock, the awe of the whole experience. Now, the biggest critique I have is also a huge plus to the game, which is that the storyteller has to make decisions. These decisions could influence the outcome of the game, which means that they are actively involved, but they also can sometimes feel a bit unfair if the storyteller favors one side or another. It isn't game-breaking or really even a concern for me, but I understand why some people might be turned away from it because of this invisible hand of a single player. Still, it's a game that engages people for hours, can involve 20 people, and generates stories you will talk about for years to come. It is the absolute peak of the original werewolf genotype, refined to a mere shine. It gets an easy S tier. Also, I have a full review of it if you want to check it out for more details. Okay, so Blood on the Clocktower can technically play 21 people if you count the storyteller. But what about games that can even play more people, and in way less time? In this case, Evolution takes us in a strange, somewhat awkward direction into a new niche. This is where a game like 2 Rooms and a Boom comes in, and instead of trying to address those selective pressures in a constructive way, it goes straight into a new focus: player count and speed. 2 Rooms and a Boom is arguably the best way to engage in a social game with more than 21 people. It does solve the moderator and elimination problems with raw physical space and social chaos. Players are split into 2 separate rooms and must exchange hostages over multiple frantic timed rounds. It has all the low-grade anxiety of a group project that's due in 10 minutes, but somehow it's enjoyable. Now, the entire game is this real-time negotiation puzzle where information control is everything. But it revamps that contract of social deduction from informed minority versus uninformed majority into a 50-50 split of opposing goals, while still keeping all the hidden roles intact. Players will go around providing snippets of information until the leader decides who are the hostages to be exchanged, which all translate into a very frantic game of hidden loyalties. And this chaos is both its greatest strength and biggest weakness. At its best, it's an electric, high-energy experience, but at its worst, if a few key players are passive, the whole game can fall flat. 2 Rooms and a Boom just feels fragile and less functional than other social deduction games. And I've seen it become bottlenecked and all the momentum just ends if all the people aren't equally engaged in this high-energy game. It's a unique experiment with different demands of players, but its heavy reliance on this energy and the frantic pace of the game itself can make the game's puzzle feel ultimately unengaging. It just feels like it's not held together as tight. So, 2 Rooms and a Boom, it's a game with flaws, and I'm not super keen on it unless I have an absolutely massive group, so I'm going to toss it into C tier. Now, 2 Rooms and a Boom moves fast, but sometimes you want that speed without all the screaming. This is where micro-deduction comes in. A classic species here is One Night Ultimate Werewolf. This game is a marvel of evolutionary efficiency and the perfect example of evolutionary miniaturization. It's the entire hour-long drama of Werewolf compressed into a 5 to 10 minute shot of pure social deduction caffeine. There's one night phase where roles fly around the table and one day phase of panicked accusations before a single final vote. But that speed comes at a significant cost. With so little information and so much murkiness, the final vote often feels less like clever deduction and more like playing pin the tail on the werewolf after being spun around blindfolded 15 times. The depth of the game just feels stripped away, and instead it's more of a fun novelty of trying to figure out who could have been what and what happened at night. It still has the flavor of Werewolf, but the game itself often feels more like a communal puzzle rather than a social experiment full of paranoia and suspicion. And for that, I'm going to put it at the lower end of C tier. Its very close relative, designed by the same dude, is Werewords. It's a clever hybrid that tries to add a bit more substance into the fast-paced social deduction. It mixes the core deduction with a 20-question style word game. The problem is that the word game is often so much more engaging than the deduction part, and it honestly feels like the two halves of the game just constantly fight for the spotlight, and neither feel like they meld into each other. It's like there's just two different games being played at once, rather than a cohesive whole. And neither part really excels, so it all just kind of feels a bit sloppy. That said, I do like the little Avalon touch trying to find the seer as the werewolf, much like taking down Merlin, but it's all really never that exciting, and the social deduction being masked over by a word game is mostly a flop for me, so it's gonna go into D tier. Okay, let's try to keep this shorter game length, but what if evolution wants to reverse things a bit? Here in Spot the Odd One Out branch, the main system of majority uninformed, minority informed becomes reversed and isolated on a singular player. In games like Spyfall and A Fake Artist Goes to New York, one player is completely in the dark while everyone else has all of the information. Their job is to simply blend in as much as possible and to act as if they know exactly what's going on. This creates a two-way tension. For example, in Spyfall, the informed majority must ask clever questions to expose the odd one out. But their questions cannot be so obvious that they give away the secret. The core skill at play is social camouflage and creativity over logical deduction, which makes a unique twist on the genre. Likewise, in A Fake Artist Goes to New York, it follows that exact same structure of Spyfall, but instead of locations and roles, everyone gets to draw lines that match a thing. All other players know what that thing is that's supposed to be drawn, but the fake needs to make convincing enough artwork to show that they actually know what that thing is. Essentially, the fake needs to draw lines that collaborate the story of every other artist in picture form. It's a really good, fun time, and it's a good entry into social deduction. These games are party icebreakers that live or die by player creativity. They're lighter on cold, hard logic than their team-based cousins, making them a fun but less deep experience. For that, I appreciate their existence, but I really don't see myself playing them very often. So I'm going to put A Fake Artist Goes to New York in the high end of C tier and Spyfall in D tier. Okay, but what happens when social deduction gets a ton of horizontal gene transfer from an entirely different game? What if you take that Spot the Odd One Out branch and just start to re-add and redevelop features like mad? That gives us the strange case of Obscurio. On the surface, its DNA is from this branch, one hidden player against a group, but it has independently evolved traits from other, more complex lineages. It has a physical board with little character tokens. It has a health pool like in the Heavyweight branch. It has a very involved moderator role in the Grimoire, and most importantly, the trader in Obscurio is once again fully informed. Obscurio has essentially re-evolved all of those vestigial organs, the board, the moderator, the informed trader, and repurposed them into something entirely new. The whole game is like a reverse Fake Artist Goes to New York, where instead of one person trying to figure out the picture that everyone else has drawn, one person is actively trying to make everyone else choose the wrong picture by misleading information that's provided. Now, of course, it would be wrong not to mention the massive, just massive amount of horizontal gene transfer from Mysterium, which essentially created the foundation of the game. You could even argue the transfer went the other way, with the social deduction genre acting as the donor species. Where it lands in the evolutionary branch is quite controversial, so I'll leave that for the comments section to debate. Anyways, what do I think of it? The concept is good. The problem is, in practice, it just feels a little fragile. The misleading aspects of the trader just don't feel very exciting, and the deception lacks the creative spark of a good lie in Spyfall. The deduction lacks the logical rigor of a game like Avalon or Quest. It just comes down to picking a vaguely similar picture that might trick a few other players into your lie. So while it's an interesting case study of the evolution of gameplay itself, it doesn't have that longevity of good social deduction games. For that, it goes down to D tier. And finally, we have to talk about distant cousins. These games are always invited to the social deduction family reunion, but a quick DNA test reveals that they belong to an entirely different clade. These are the pure bluffing games. There is a very crucial difference. In a game like Avalon, there is a truth. Someone is a minion of Mordred, You just need to find out who's what, and there's an arc to the trust and suspicion. In Avalon, you have a role in the bigger puzzle at large, and your job is to find that truth or hide from it and solve the puzzle. But in a game like Coup or Skull, there is no truth. There is only the void. There are no spies to find, no werewolves to hunt. There is only what players claim to have. The entire game of Skull and Coup are essentially very high-stakes games of chicken, built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated lies. It's not about the larger puzzle, but more of an individual and mostly symmetrical bluffing experience. Both Skull and Coup share the same beautiful spirit of deception, but their mechanical DNA evolved down a completely separate path. That said, they still are interesting species in their own right. I put Skull into C tier, and the master of micro-bluffing, Coup, into B tier. So there it is, the phylogeny of a lie. From a simple primal soup of paranoia and finger-pointing, we get this sprawling ecosystem of games, each one adapted to its own unique niche. I really just wanted to talk about how one single idea can be mutated, and from design pressures or certain desires, which takes the entire genre into new niches. Like how the entire mission-based genre was born as an attempt to solve those two fundamental design flaws in Werewolf, or how those micro-deduction games miniaturize the puzzle into bite-sized bits due to time restraints. So this all brings me back to my core issue: originality. And truthfully, I really don't know what true originality is, or how it can be made, or if it's a thing to even begin with. I mean, even the first game of Mafia, that was based on the Mafia. Or was it based on our innate sense of fearing the other? But there is some kind of lightning in the bottle, a once-in-a-generation essence of originality in the gamification of that human condition, isn't there? I struggle with even the concept of an original idea, but abiogenesis and evolution are two different things in our real, tangible world. So I also accept true originality and mutation of ideas to be different as well. One of them is very, very rare. The other is much more common, but both are fascinating topics to unearth. I suppose it's all just different forms of creativity. Originality and mutation and adaptation are two mechanisms of the creative process. Originality acts as that unique lightning in a bottle spark, and the relentless mutation and adaptations lead to moving a genre forward. I'm not really sure that's good enough for me just yet as an answer, but it's a start, I suppose. Anyways, swinging back to the evolutionary tree and that tier list I made up, what really speaks to me is just how hard it is to move a genre forward. There's a certain stickiness of a game that exists in the communal mind, and more often than not, it's just a blip. The game's influence is gone the moment the shrink wrap is pulled apart. But some other games like The Resistance or Battlestar become these evolutionary jumping off points that have their DNA in the very roots of game design. Other games like Obscurio sometimes feel like an evolutionary dead end, even though it is a little weird and wacky and it combines a lot of aspects. I just don't see how it really moves forward. And look, I've talked about originality, evolution, creativity, how game DNA stays within the future of other games. I've ranked all of these games in a tier list, and I bet you all want a nice little bow tie to put it all together. A grand, unified theory of game evolution. But honestly, dudes, I just don't have that. I won't claim to have the answer. I have thoughts and feelings that likely need a whole nother video just to expand upon. But truthfully, I'm way more curious about your own opinions now. So what are your thoughts, feelings, emotions on this whole topic? And obviously, I haven't covered the hundreds of games that exist on this tree, and how all these branches branch into dozens of different genera of games. I'd love to see where other people think these games branch from, so definitely let me know. And as always, thank you for watching. It means a lot to me, and bye.